You're listening to the Sketchnote Army podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rohde, the author of the Sketchnote Handbook and the Sketchnote Workbook, and this is the podcast where I chat with sketchnoters and visual thinkers and try to understand what makes them tick. This season of the Sketchnote Army podcast is presented to you by the Sketchnote Handbook's 10th birthday, and we're giving you the gifts. Save 50% when you buy any two of the Sketchnote Handbook, the Sketchnote Workbook, or the Sketchnote Handbook video together as a set. Offer applies to both the print and ebook editions of the books. Use discount code HAPPY10 at checkout to apply savings. That's HAPPY10. For details on this offer, visit rohdesign.com/happy10. That's rohdesign.com/happy10. Offer ends December 31st, 2022, so buy yours today. And now, on with the show. Hey everyone, this is Mike Rohde. I'm here with my friend and co-sketchnoter Michael Clayton, better known as Prof. Clayton on the interwebs. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Not a problem. Whenever we do these shows where we need someone to interview me, because I obviously can't interview myself, I call on my friend Mike because he knows me probably the best of anybody in the community. We've traveled together. We've stayed in hotels with bidets together and made fun of the bidets together. So we've got history, and I really love Mike. He's a great dude, and couldn't think of anybody else better to ask some questions about the Sketchnote Handbook on its 10th birthday celebration episode. So with that intro, I'm just going to turn it right over to Mike and get started with whatever he's got cooked up in his brain over there.
Hey, everybody. Yep, it's me. You know, the funny thing is, in the Sketchnote world, I kind of had to go by Prof, because if I never mentioned Mike, it's Mike Rohde, not Mike Clayton. So, so in an essence, Mike, you are interviewing yourself, because this is Mike interviewing Mike, which is a wonderful way to think of. So Mike's asked me to go out into the interwebs across the various parts of social media and get your questions to ask him about this wonderful book. And I actually have mine right here, right? The Sketchnote Handbook, and its baby brother, so to speak, the Sketchnote Workbook, which we'll talk about in a couple of years when that turns 10.
Yeah.
But one of the things is, speaking about 10 years ago, just as a little interlude, I've told this story before, but I think a 2-minute retelling might be better. But, I actually bumped into Mike on Twitter about 12 years ago and just started following him. And then one day, as an academic, I was attending a conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I got up the guff to send him a DM and say, "Hey, Mike, I'm going to be in Milwaukee for a conference. Can I take you out to lunch?" And so he wrote me back and asked me where I was going to be staying at. And I told him, he's like, "Dude, that's like a couple of blocks from where I work." So we got together and had lunch. And I remember it was October 8th or 10th of 2012. So it was 10 years ago, just a couple of weeks ago. And he said that he had just gotten done sending the manuscript off for the Sketchnote Handbook. And I just sat there going, wow, what was that like? And I remember sitting there in that big open eatery place. What was that place again?
The Milwaukee Public Market, right down in the Third Ward. Yeah.
And so we sat there, and he was telling me stories about going through and writing it. And the funny thing is about how, sometimes Mike talks about having 4 kids, and this was his third, because his son was born just a little while later, which I remember talking about. But it's been fun getting to know Mike over the last 10 years, and especially getting to use this book. And just as a fun anecdote, I like to tease Mike that I'm probably the one that has given away the most copies of this book.
Yeah.
Because as a professor teaching sketchnoting, I've had it required for probably about 150 students over the course of the last 10 years. Plus, it makes a great gift. So if you want to head over and buy it and give it away, Mike will talk about that later. But one of the things was really interesting about the Sketchnote Handbook. It was really one of the first books to really hit the market to talk about sketchnoting as a personal thing. We had lots of books before on graphic recording or graphic facilitation or something along those lines, but really there was nothing personal on the market about this book. So, Mike, I know you've answered this question before, but can you tell us, why write a book? What was it that got in your saddle that made you want to put pen to paper for a book?
Well, that's a good question. I for a long time I'd wanted to write a book since I was a little kid, but as I got older, I just thought, well, what am I going to write a book about? I'm not a fiction writer, really. If I did anything, it would be nonfiction. But what am I going to write about? I mean, nothing really had ever come to me. Like, even as a designer, there weren't really design books that I felt led to write, because I was right in the golden age of design books, right? So it was not necessarily easy to come up with something new and different. Or if I went technology that isn't, has to be redone in like a year, right? So I don't want to go down that path either. But I remember there were two people that sort of encouraged me to do it. The first was Patrick Rohde, who we've got, there's an interview with Patrick several seasons back where we've talked a little bit about his use of sketchnotes in his own life personally. So he and I crossed paths. He's in Minneapolis, St. Paul specifically, and I'm in Milwaukee. So we just happened to connect up when I went to Minneapolis, and we had just crossed paths in other times. And he kept bothering me, like, Mike, the stuff you're doing is really cool. You should write a book. Like, he probably said it a couple of times, and I took it to heart. But I did, again, I felt like I wasn't ready. I was busy. There's always some excuse, right? Which I guess maybe the cautionary tale here is, don't let yourself talk yourself out of a book if you think you have an idea. So he said it. And then when I was in Portland, I was visiting another friend that I'd made, another fellow designer, Von Glitchka, who, if you look him up, he's kind of a nut. He is amazing at Adobe Illustrator and logo design and icon design and stuff. And he had been writing books with Peachpit. And so we were in Portland. I said, hey, Von, let's go have dinner. We'll bring our wives. We'll have some Thai food. So we did. And over dinner, he went hard on me about, like, you got to write a book. You have to write a book. I've got an editor. I've got a publishing house. I know exactly what to do. Mike, will you write a book? And I kind of relented. Okay, I'll be happy to talk with your editor. And the funny story I tell is we went to Portland without a car. So we rode the train into our hotel. So Vaughn and his wife took us to the venue where we had dinner, took us back. And as we got out of the car, like, I saw Vaughn flipping his laptop open, and we walked into the hotel. I didn't think anything of it. We got up the elevator in our room, and I checked my email because we had been gone for quite a bit of the day. And there was already an email from Vaughn to his editor, Nikki, who is now my editor, saying, hey, you need to meet this guy. He's got a book he needs to write about Sketchnote. It's like, holy cow, this guy's like seriously wanting this book to happen. So that was really the spark that sort of moved it forward. Once I got connected with Nikki, then she sort of laid out for me, like, here's what I need from you. Here's what you need to do. And I just started whatever she told me to do. I did. And for those of you listening to the special or watching the special edition, I've got an interview later with Nikki that you can check out, where we talk a little bit about that time and what we saw as the book was made and the impact of it. So that is really the origin story of those two people, Patrick Rohde and Von Glitchka, really leaning on me, thinking it was really important, and then me finally relenting and listening and doing something.
I'm surprised that Vaughn didn't push you into another company to make some, video tutorials and lessons and things like that, which you did with the original Sketchnote Handbook. Right. Can you talk to us a little bit about those videos and how they came about and the popularity of them and how they kind of helped to elevate the book?
Well, that's a good question too. So this is Von Glitchka I think it was lynda.com at the time, which is now LinkedIn Learning. So you can probably find all his stuff in LinkedIn Learning. At the time, he was still hardcore, big author with Peachpit. Lynda had not courted him yet, or at least not that I'm aware of. So he was still doing that and focused on writing books. So it was a little time later that he switched over and went to Lynda, and kind of pretty much went directly to video only, right? I think he stepped out of bookmaking.
Yep.
that I'm aware of. The interesting thing is we really focused on the book first. But as we talked, it was around this time that lynda.com, which is now LinkedIn Learning, was starting to gain some traction in the market. Like they were seen as sort of the preeminent video people. Now, reminding you that this is 2010, YouTube and video and all that stuff kind of didn't exactly exist yet, or at least not in the form that we think of it now. So video was hard. There wasn't a lot of it. So to be the leader in it was impressive, but also there just weren't a whole lot of competitors either, right? So Lynda was sort of coming up, and I think Peachpit felt the pressure that they had to keep up with lynda.com and whatever other competitors they saw in the space. So they really were heavily interested in doing a video. And because we focused on this book being evergreen, we felt like doing a video of the same content, but in a slightly different way, being able to show things, being able to explain things, was really a cool way to go. So as part of the contract, I was hired to also do a video companion that would go in the back of the book. Some other really interesting tidbits. It turns out that one of my best friends is Brian Artka, who's a video storyteller. So I immediately knew who I was going to hire to do the work, and that was Brian, which we did. I also knew a guy named Gabe who had written scripts for TV and commercials. So I hired him as a contractor to help convert the text that I was still in the middle of writing and convert it into scripts that I could then boil down even further to bullet points and read on camera. And honestly, it was weird to be on camera because I had, it's not like today where everybody's on YouTube or Snapchat or Instagram or whatever. Being on video is not uncommon now, but back then it was kind of weird and I had to get used to that. So the last little quirky thing about these videos is that in the olden days, Peachpit would include a CD or later on a DVD in the back of their books. And this 2010 was right about that time they were switching over to online, right? They're trying to get in that space. So it was like a tear off tab. And inside there was a code that you would go to peachpit.com and enter this code, and all the videos would be online. You could watch them there, download them, right? Yeah. So there's a little code thing. So I was right at that pivot point as well. So that was kind of unique. So all those things kind of fed together. Looking back, like it was a great experience shooting a video because it really made me think about what we worked on. The other thing I'll say about the video is it really informed the book itself. So as an example, if you look at I think if you are able to find video number 9 from the Sketchnote Handbook, which I think you can find on Vimeo. If you do a search, you can find it, and I'll dig up the link. You can see me sketchnoting a talk from beginning to end. It's my friend John Miller talking about his experience drumming. Just an interesting discussion. Mm-hmm. And my friend Brian shot a video of the talk happening. So it was a picture of the talk being going on, but also he had a handheld camera and he was over my shoulder videoing me while I was building the sketchnote. And then what he did is he synced them together and he would do cutaways. So he'd do like a B-roll cutaway between John and me, and you could hear John talking and see me like drawing on the page. We've heard a lot that's like one of the favorite videos from the book because it really shows like what does it look like when it's happening. So not only was it a cool video, but it actually really helped me doing the book because I had a section of the book where I wanted to identify step by step, like what stuff did I do first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and I was like, I have no idea. I don't remember exactly what I did first. So fortunately, I got the raw cut of me sketchnoting from Brian, and I just played that on my Mac, and then I could sort of deconstruct which parts went in which order. So it really did inform the book itself and made the book better by having that video recording. I think probably the sadness around the video is I think a lot of people don't know it exists because it's a code in the back of a book. It's not like a disc that you can't miss. Some people would buy the used books and the code wouldn't work. Mm-hmm. There was other frictions around logging in and doing it online and all these kind of things. So there was a little bit of sadness around like, I wish that had gotten more traction. We talked about maybe offering it to another platform. It was on Udemy for a while, so you could buy it on Udemy separately. Right now you can buy it online from Peachpit directly if you want to see it, but I kind of felt like it was the lost stepchild in a way, right? It never really got the attention, and I feel like that's one of the coolest things that we did was the video, and especially the way we interpreted the book and made it into video content, that for many people to see it happening is really valuable. Like some people can read it, imagine it, and understand it, but there's some people who really identify with seeing it going on. And I felt like there was a missed opportunity that we could have maybe promoted or pushed that further or negotiated with someone to release it to a broader audience than it ended up getting to. So
yeah,
that's the story of the video.
So I'm going to pop a question in that I got from one of the social media ites that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
He asked, what was it like working with other illustrators who appeared in the books?
Well, the story behind that is I loved it. I thought it was great. And the reason that it even happened was because I felt like I did not want to produce a book that was all my artwork. And it was like the Mike Rohde way to do sketch notes. I mean, it's already got enough of my stuff having illustrated it, which was an intention. But I didn't want everything to be that, because my concern was this, that if it was all my work and it was all my stuff, people would think, well, that's the only way to do it. Like that's the way to do it. And it would become sort of the standard. And if somebody looked at it and thought, I can't do that work, I'm not that good, I'm not a designer, like it would turn people off and they would just never give it a try and give up. So I felt like I need to get not only a variety of people in the book, but I need to find people that are not trained designers, people that are regular people. It's like Jessica Esch is a perfect example of someone like this. She's a librarian in Maine, but she loved sketchnoting. She was finding it really useful and helpful. And so I reached out to her and she submitted work to us. And, at the other end of the spectrum, I have Eva Lotta Lamb as a sample. She's an amazing sketchnoter. She's an accomplished designer, visual thinker. So, I mean, those would be like the two ends of the spectrum, kind of. And there were all different people in between. But even like the samples, as I started to flesh out like what I was trying to say, once I knew what that was, then I started approaching people and saying, hey, I would love to have your piece in the book for this section. I would try to give them context and explain. Everybody was really understanding. And it was actually really fun for me because my intention was to show, hey, I had been seeing this 5-6 years before the book existed. Like there's a community, and the cool thing about it is everybody's stuff is so different, and yet they all conform to pretty common principles, and yet they're so different because of the personalities. I want to somehow capture this in the book, so when people see it, they'll think like, well, I can't be like Eva Lotta, but I could be like Jessica, right? That could be a thought process that would go in their head, or some other sample that they might see through the book. Even, in the book, I emphasize a ton, like if you have the book, ton of times that, bad drawings still work. Like you don't have to be an amazing artist. That's like I repeated it so often, I got complaints in the reviews that it was repetitive. But I felt like it was because so many people have this baggage and burden of I can't draw in their lives that they almost need someone to tell them like 5 times that you can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. So that was the whole intention, like the idea behind it. And I think that really does come through. I've heard people remark that seeing other people's work in there really made them feel like they could pull it off. So yeah.
And that really falls back. I think just a few days ago, didn't you release the permission to suck at drawing certificate?
Yes. Yeah, we'll link up to that. I'm looking into like doing little stickers because apparently it's like super popular. It was just sort of a tongue-in-cheek joke for a workshop that I taught. Like, well, wouldn't it be interesting if I made a certificate and it says like chill out, the right to take the time I want, and yep. It's sort of like this. It's really funny. It's sort of tongue-in-cheek and silly. But yet people really responded to it because, it sort of does give you permission. Like you don't have to be this amazing artist, and you sort of let go of it. Like it's like the last finger on the baggage is being let go when you sign that paper, right? So yep. It's funny, and yet it's also poignantly accurate and useful. So it's just sort of an experiment that seems like it's touched a nerve. And so I'm going to pursue it a little bit and see, hey, there's some things I can produce, like pads of these things to give teachers, or stickers that you can put on your laptop. Like, I mean, there's all kinds of fun things could be done with it. So
I know I want to take it and print it out and put it in a frame and hang it next to my degrees in my office on campus. And like, what's this one about? What's really funny is that question actually came from Paul Supase, one of our common friends,
yes,
who is featured in the first book. Mm-hmm. And he had a follow-up story or a follow-up question that he wanted to ask. And it was also, tell us a story or two about transitioning the books and the pieces into the non-English translations.
So I've had a variety of experiences. The most recent one, I'll sort of work most recent to the earliest. The most recent one was Vietnamese. And it was just this strange, I'm trying to think where I got reached by this. If it was an email or a direct message, kind of doesn't matter. But someone from Vietnam, a Vietnamese person, this guy reached out and said, hey, I want to translate your book into Vietnamese. Can you help me? And I said, sure. So I introduced him to the rights people at Peachpit, made the introduction, and sort of forgot about it. And then I don't know, like 2 months later, copies of both books wrapped in plastic in Vietnamese appeared on my door in a box. I think there was a lot of them. I think there was like 5 of each or something like that. So it was like, I simply said, yeah, go for it. And they sort of took care of everything. We made sure they, of course, had all the Photoshop files and stuff. But they took it from there and did all the language translation. I know in China, so I worked with the translator for the Chinese version, and she had lived in China, but also lived in Amsterdam. So she was a fluent English speaker. And working with her was fascinating because she told me that for the Chinese reader, like some of the idioms that I was using were very Western or even very American idioms that a Chinese person would look at and like, what are you talking about? Like, so she had to because she knew English and Western culture, she sort of translated those into similar Chinese idioms or ones that would communicate the idea. Mm-hmm. And so the samples were really interesting to see like how she translated. I couldn't obviously read the Chinese. So at some point you have to rely on these translators to do a good job. It's really out of your control. But it was kind of cool to think like the whole idiom needed to change so it would make sense to a Chinese reader. The French and the German editions were really hands-on. So both the French first, or the German first, and the French after that, editors worked with me really closely. We set up a Basecamp account. I secured a bunch of this. So we replaced whole samples with as much French or German samples as we could in those books, particularly the 2-page spreads. So I think in the German one, Evalata actually swapped all her English to German. Mm-hmm. And I think in the French one, she might have done the same. I'd have to look again. It's been a while. But I was pretty heavily involved in sourcing replacements so that it would have a more localized feeling, right? So you want to show French people in these books or German sketchnoters in these books so it would be relevant, because unfortunately for them, they had limited budgets, and as they could change the text and had designers that could change headlines. But in many cases, the samples, they couldn't, with the time frame they have, replace everything with a German replacement or a French replacement. So some of the English did remain in those books. So that was interesting. The 2 that were most fascinating were, well, I'll say 3 that were most fascinating. One was the Russian and Ukrainian editions, the Russian first and Ukrainian after. They secured the rights, and they were crazy. Like, they went through the whole book and they replaced all the text with Russian Cyrillic text. Even in the sketch notes. So they went into the sketch notes and someone like hand wrote in Cyrillic. It was like, I looked at the book and it was almost like if I was a Russian and I wrote it with a Russian publishing team. It was that's
pretty
detailed. Yes. And the same thing with the Ukrainian edition was similar. The last story I'll tell about language editions is the Czech language edition was somewhere in between. I think there was some replacement and some, some not. But they were really interesting in that they invited Gail and I to come and attend a conference. The publisher did. Say, hey, you want to come over to Prague? I'm like, sure, why not? So we bought a flight. We flew through Germany, ended up in Prague for a couple of days. That's where I met Mauro Tiselli and his partner for the first time, and hung out in Prague together for a long weekend, and got to be on Prague and Czech Republic national TV in the morning.
Wow.
And talk about sketchnotes. So there's that happened, and quite, you just never know. Or like, you write this book, and years later, suddenly you're sitting in Prague on a TV show talking about your sketchnotes of your team losing in a championship game and laughing about it with these hosts. So I mean, weird things happen in life, and I can't explain them, but you just got to be ready and sort of go with the flow.
So all in all, how many different languages is the Sketchnote Handbook available in?
I always have to count this. I should probably have it on a list somewhere. So obviously English, German, French, Russian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Czech, and Ukrainian. I think that's it. Is that 5?
That's 8.
Eight languages.
Is it in Polish?
It is not in Polish.
We're still waiting for Spanish one of these days.
Yeah,
right?
Spanish is the odd one. I don't understand exactly why it hasn't been translated into Spanish yet. I will say this, that part of the reason why, like, as an example, Austin Kleon's book, Steal Like an Artist, and my book came out almost around the same time. They had really similar look and feel. Austin and I are acquaintances, and we've had barbecue together and stuff. But his was translated in far more languages. I think his publisher was probably more aggressive about doing it. There's probably more demand because it's more like a big market book than mine was. Mine's more niche, right? But I think also mine is complex to translate because there's just the whole thing is illustrated. Like even Austin's has images and text, and you can kind of, you can sort of modify the images and then just flow the text in another language, and it kind of works. And mine was complex. You had to hire like an illustrator of some kind, or a designer at least, to make it happen. Not even to point out like the Russians had like a team. Like if you look in the team, there was like 6 or 7 people that redid that book in Russian. So all the publishers sort of took it in their own way.
What's interesting is, as time marches on, and the Sketchnote workbook, came out soon after, and we'll save that for another day. But about the same time as this book came out, the iPad was released, and then within a few years, people were trying to do different styluses and different things for them, and then the Apple Pencil came out, then the Apple Pencil 2, and we got things like Procreate and Paper 53 and all the rest of those wonderful things. And sketchnoting took a decisive turn towards the digital, and folks were abandoning, maybe setting aside their Moleskines and their different notebooks to embrace this digital medium. How do you feel about sketchnotes moving digital versus staying pen and paper?
Well, I think it's a natural progression. I was waiting for the iPad to get good enough to use. If you look in the handbook, you can see appearances of my phone and my old iPad in there. But they were really not considered tools, because at the time they just weren't. Like, even with the styluses and the software that existed, the fine-grained control that you get with an Apple Pencil and an iPad Pro just didn't exist, and it was impractical unless you modified your whole approach, right? So it didn't even enter my mind. However, when Nikki and I talked about the book, we wanted it to be evergreen. And so we said, okay, we understand the technology's here. There's a really good chance that iPads will get better. But we're going to focus on principles and the principles of sketchnotes, and to make sure we cover those regardless of whether you use paper or an iPad. And so I think that was a really smart move on our part, I guess, that we didn't focus so much on technology, because the whole thing about Peachpit was they were in this trap already. Like a lot of Peachpit's books, which are tech press, always have to be revised. It's Photoshop 6, Photoshop 6.1, Photoshop 6.2. They're always making these changes. You've encountered this, Mike, with some of the books that you've taught, right? That if you depend on technology, it changes so fast that you're constantly chasing it. You're following it. They wanted to get out of that with this book and with other books that talked more about principles and approaches and mindsets and things. So we kind of consciously avoided technology, even though we could have pursued it more. There's a little bit of a touch in it. because of that, because we knew that the book would hold up even if what happened did happen. iPads got really good and became a platform. So I think from the book perspective, I think that was good because the principles are still the same. You can still read the book, and you can do it on paper, you can do it on an iPad, either way. I am excited about the iPad. I use it all the time. I still use paper and pen, and I think it's probably a 50-50 split, maybe. I don't know. For me, it really depends on the customer or the purpose. So I always think about what's the purpose first, and that will dictate my approach. And sometimes my purpose will have self-imposed limitations just to make it fun and interesting, right? So if I'm going to do something with quick turnaround, or it's a customer who's a client who needs changes or iterations, it just naturally makes sense to go with the iPad, because you just have so much power of undo and moving and redoing that's not so painful, right? So the iPad is super powerful that way, and there's tools now that are really powerful for that. But there are some times when I think having pen and paper is valuable, when it's hard for your notebook to distract you with a tweet or someone bothering you to wonder, when you're going to do this or that, right? You can sort of get away with a piece of paper or a notebook and a pen. And they never run out of batteries. You don't have to wait for them to start up, and the beauty is you can still draw in paper and pen and then take photos of it and still keep records. So even if your book gets lost, you can have a record and store it permanently if you want to. So, right, there's definitely trade-offs. I always thought the pen and paper was a great foundation, and I always thought of the iPad Pro as an extension, not as a replacement. I just, probably because I was trained by my dad to always look at what is the problem you're solving, choose the right tool to solve the problem. You don't build a house with a screwdriver instead of a hammer, right? You use hammer and nails or screws, same kind of thing. I think the principles remain the same, and I think however you choose to approach it, those principles come through in the book. And who knows where, in 10 years iPads might be reading our brains, right? We might not even use our hands anymore. I don't know. And the concepts are still the same.
See, and the interesting thing is, as a graphic designer myself, I have had in my studios Wacom tablets, and I've had all sorts of digital tablet devices and things like that, but it never dawned on me to do sketchnoting with that, because the paper and the pen was just so much more permanent, right?
Right.
You talked about being able to go in and change and modify those things. Do you think that as sketchnoting has evolved into a digital form, that it's lost some of the character when it comes to doing analog ones?
That's a good question. I think yes and no. I would say yes. I've been looking at sketchnotes for a project, and I've just sort of noticed that when I see Procreate or iPad based things, and Eva Lotta's talked about this in an interview a long time ago, that she can sort of spot when it looks like it's software, like it sort of has a look to it. And I think you can overcome a lot of that now with brushes and the way you can tweak your stuff, and the engines, the ink engines that some of these tools are able to produce, that make it look like ink on paper, right? Even with bleeding, and even paper by WeTransfer back in the day could do this watercolor that would look like it's bleeding in paper. And I think their ink engine is still one of the best ink engines that I've ever used, even considering Procreate and some of the other tools. It just really feels like I'm using a pen. It's just digital, right? So there's definitely some things you can spot, but I think also opening up the field or the opportunity to use those opens up more people to using it, and especially professionals who want to do it, gives them a tool that makes it possible. You've been in that case where you've done them both ways, and there's huge advantages to doing it digitally that it's hard to avoid, right? On the other side, I think there is something interesting about the limitations of pen and paper and time and space that make those sketch notes interesting, because you can't do undo. And if you put something on the page, now you got to work around it, and you have to commit. Like, my first experiments were all about forcing myself to go to a conference with a little book and a pen instead of a big book and a pencil, listen to these ideas and really process and only capture the things that made most sense to capture, and very few of them, because my page was too small to capture everything. So I had to be super selective. So it trained me in this way of sort of listening and thinking and processing and then capturing, that I think even if you're regularly doing digital stuff, it's not a bad idea to do some experiments with, physical books and pens to remind yourself that limitations are really valuable and a good thing to keep you on your toes. Like I think about this often, like when comedians go up, they can either kill or they can die. It's really interesting the terms they use if you get into humor, right? They go up on stage. If you get a good crowd, you could kill, right? You're like super popular. People remember you the rest of their lives. Or you could like have the wrong material and you could die up there and be terrible and people would boo you off the stage, right? And I think the draw of all this is a little bit of the performance. In that case, it's public performance. And in the case for me doing it, it's sort of like private performance. Like, man, this could really go sideways. And that's kind of exciting. Like not everybody likes that, but there's something that I learned by having limitations and like, I got to make this work. Like there's something fun and exciting about it, maybe going wrong, because when it goes right, it's like, oh yeah, I overcame the possibility that it could go wrong. I overcame that I only had this little book. I overcame that I only had one pen, that I only had limited time, and I had to make it all kind of work together. There's something super satisfying about when you could pull it off. That's really cool. So I would advise sketchnoters who maybe are fully or mostly digital to not forget about your analog roots and pull it out, even if just for experiments.
Pick up the pen again. Pick up the pen again. It's interesting because it's kind of interesting over the last decade as sketchnotes have kind of moved to a bigger forefront. They start to look a little more glossy, a little more polished, a little more finished, and that was not the intention when the handbook came out. It was this raw and in the moment kind of thing, and yeah, it kind of gets lost a little bit. So if Peachpit were to come back to you and say, hey Mike, we want to have you do a second edition of this book for the 10th anniversary, what chapter would you have added to this book? What would you have tacked on to it to kind of make it a better edition?
Well, I mean, the immediate temptation is to say digital, like, and maybe that would be a chapter, right? Is maybe it would be more talking about kind of like what we were, like the advantages of digital, the reasons why digital is useful, but also the warning that digital can trick you. Like you can noodle forever. I know you and I both have this challenge where you're doing a sketch that like, I could like noodle with that thing forever. I got to like cut it off because it's endless. I can keep changing things over and over for hours and hours. And if you're on a job, like you don't make money when you do that, right? If you spend too many hours on a project, you're making like, McDonald's money or something, right? So maybe I would talk about like the pros and cons of digital versus analog and show samples and that kind of stuff, and maybe get into, but again, I think I would keep it really principled. I wouldn't specifically talk about hardware because like tomorrow the hardware can change. I mean, the iPads just got released and they're a little bit different now. So within, we wanted it to last a long time, and it has lasted 10 years because we focused on principles, and I would find a way to focus on principles there as well. And maybe, if I were to say another option, if we didn't do digital, or maybe in addition to it, would be the importance of focusing on doing it for yourself. Like, I think it was sort of implied there, but maybe I would go even more emphasizing that stop worrying about doing this for other people. Do your, bad drawings and sketches, and maybe have samples of like a whole chapter full of really bad, rough sketches that work. I know this is dear to your heart. You did a talk on this at the ISC years ago about, I guess I don't know what the term was, but bad sketches.
It was the search for the ugly sketch note.
Ugly sketch notes, yeah. And I know Eva Lotta just wrote an article about this recently. That it's about functionality and practicality, where it's just to solve a problem, and maybe you never show it to anybody. right? You do it and it stays in your book, and it never gets on Instagram, it never gets on TikTok, it never gets on Snapchat, like, and that's okay. Like, I think there's probably the one thing that I see around sketchnotes is I probably see more of them than maybe I need to. Like, and I'm not, and I'm the sketchnote guy, and I love seeing them, and I love seeing different approaches, but feels like some of this stuff, like, I don't know, maybe we just need to keep yourself, or it's more valuable to just you than to the whole world. I don't know.
I think that one of the coolest things is workshops with kids that are between 7 and 12. Because when I've done that in the elementary school space, and it's cool because they think it's the best thing ever, and you look at it and you're like, yes, it is, just keep going, because it just has that rawness, that power, because it is for them. And I'm one of those sketchnoters that maybe 2% of all the sketchnotes I've ever done have appeared online, and people are always asking for more and more and more. But it is that internal kind of for you, thing for this. In all of the years and all of the workshops and all of the talks and all of the conferences and all the invites and everything that's happened and transpired, in those almost 4,000 days since this book came out, right? What printing is this handbook on?
That is a good question. There's not editions, and I don't know if that's because of the way Peachpit works or what. They're still printing the same version. There might be typo chain fixes in there that I'm not aware of, but it's kind of the same artwork that I delivered 10 years ago that they're running. I'm sure they printed it multiple times, but they wouldn't call it an edition. I think something has to change, but I don't know. I don't know.
Well, that's just like printing, like you'll get a comic book. Like I know that this right here is one of the first printings, right?
Right. And it's probably got to be in the teens or the 20s of printings, I suspect, because, well, I could tell you this, that I asked the editor, I said, can you give me, like, I know you can't give me exact numbers easily because it's a pain. Their systems are so antiquated and hard to get into. But I said, can you give me like a rough estimate, if you look at the systems, like how many of the Sketchnote Handbook, including printed book, digital book, video, all that stuff, like how many have sold? And she came back and said 60,000.
Wow.
60,000 copies of that crazy book. And, we had no budget. We, they promoted it a little bit, but they're kind of a niche, publisher. A lot of the work that I did was guerrilla, and it was just people finding it and liking it and sharing it, and like you, giving it to people or having them buy it. So that's pretty cool to sell 60,000 copies without having any kind of marketing budget or anything like that. And it keeps on selling. I mean, obviously we're trying to sell more with this 10th birthday with, the special deals and stuff like that. But obviously what I'm really satisfied is that the work we did to make it evergreen and sort of a classic. I guess we hoped it would become a classic. We had no idea. I mean, it could have turned out nobody would have bought it and it would have died, but that's not the way it worked out. We were lucky in some sense. So yeah, that's pretty fascinating. 60,000.
So, the Sketchnote Handbook has spawned many other writers into creating their own books on sketchnotes. Some great, some not so great, some that you and I have tried to get taken off of Amazon because they are so poor, and different things like that. But you think of all the things that you've done for people with the Sketchnote Handbook. Are there any other books that you've seen by other authors that you think might have the same impact?
Well, I can say, I mentioned one earlier in the discussion, was Austin Kleon, Steal Like an Artist. I remember one, his came out like, I don't know, a month before mine, 2 months, something like that. They were right in the same window of time. Maybe his was September, mine was December. I remember buying his book, and I think I took my son for a haircut, and I pretty much read the whole book while sitting waiting for my son to get his haircut. And as soon as I was done reading that book, it's like, I got to make something. I have to make something right now. Like, I have to go back and do something now. And I thought that would be cool if my book was like that too, where you would read it. It wouldn't take long, but the seed that it planted would make you want to do stuff. That would be super cool. I'm trying to think if there's other books that come to the top of my head. What about you, Mike? Are there any books for you that sort of stand out that way?
Oh, you know that right back over there in that
Well,
shelf, those bottom three shelves are all visual note-taking books. And I think that probably one of them that I've been most impressed with is your equal over on the other side of the water when we talk about Nadine Rosa. It's in German,
yeah,
and I only have the German edition of it, but wow, it's got a lot of really good insights and things like that. And that's why it was kind of interesting to see your German copy sitting next to hers when we were over in Hamburg a couple of years ago,
right.
to see that. But one of the things is you've kind of really opened up the world, this idea of sketchnoting, and dozens of authors have come by and tried to surpass this and try to do something a little bit better than it. But in my opinion, and it's as biased as I'll get out, nothing can quite top what the Sketchnote Handbook has done for me and for my career and for my students and for the folks that I give it to. So it's a wonderful happy birthday to the Sketchnote Handbook. And even though it's been around for 10 years, I know it's going to be around for a long, long time, and we have you to thank for it. I know we need to have a moment of silence for, we have our Star Wars, we have our Empire Strikes Back, and we kind of have to, pour one out or have a moment of silence for the Return of the Jedi that never happened. But I think that with these two books right here, it's given us a nice depth and breadth, both with the handbook to show us what to do or how to do it, and then the Sketchnote workbook showing us how to apply it to many different things. And we'll talk about that book a little bit later. But I just want to say on behalf of sketchnoters everywhere, Mike, thank you for writing this, and thank you for bringing people together. There are people who have bonded and have met each other because of this book and been able to capture everything from talks to lessons to life moments. You and I both know that there have been books that have been done of sketch notes that are political journals. We've seen some that are people's journeys through hard times. Even Evalata's trip around the world when she did her book, or even the visual MBA sketch note that was done a few
Jason
years
Barron.
ago.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that when you drop a pebble into a pond, we know that one pebble has weight and substance, but the effects of that ripple can keep going and tussle lily pads over here or hit reeds over there, and sometimes even hit bigger things. And I just think on behalf of sketchnoters everywhere, thank you for the work that you've done. Thank you for the Sketchnote Handbook. And with that, I think this interview is over, unless you've got something to say. Or
No, this is great. I think if you're really into it and you want to hear a little bit more of the origin story again of the book and how it happened and why we did what we did and some of the stories of impact, keep listening to part 2, which is with my editor on the project, Nikki. We talk a little more nuts and bolts and why do we think it worked and what we were thinking at the time, as much as we can remember 10 years later. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up next. Thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate those kind words, and I'm glad, I'm honored that I could be in this position to do this work. And I just feel like, this is what I've been called to do, and I'm glad that I've had the opportunity, and I hope I've done it well.
And thank you for asking me to come back on the podcast again and be able to talk to you for a time. It's always a pleasure.
Great. All right, everyone. Up next, Nikki McDonald. This episode of the Sketchnote Army podcast is brought to you by Concepts, an infinite, flexible, creative tool for all your good ideas, available on iOS, Windows, and Android. The new Concept 6 for iOS has exciting new features, including a modernized canvas interface, a freshly structured, easier-to-use gallery that integrates with the iOS Files app, and RGB and HSL color options added to its already extensive Copic color palettes. Concept's infinite canvas lets you spread out and sketch in any direction. Draw and take notes with liquid pens, markers, and brushes in your favorite colors. Everything you draw in Concepts is a flexible vector, so you can move your notes around the canvas or change their color, tool, or size with simple gestures. Drag and drop images onto the canvas, and use layers and grids to organize your creative space. When you're ready to share, export straight to your friends or team. Search Concepts in your favorite app store for infinite, flexible sketching. Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of this special edition for the Sketchnote Handbook 10th birthday. In this part, I sat down and I talked with my former editor, the one who helped me make the Sketchnote Handbook happen in the very beginning. And we talked a little bit about things we remember from the creation of that book, what made it unique. We talk a little bit about stories of impact after 10 years of being in the world and some of the funny things that we remember. So it'd be helpful if you're someone who's considering writing a book and you're curious about what publishing is like and the changes between 10 years ago and today. So please enjoy, and thanks for watching and listening. So I don't know, I haven't thought a ton about exactly what I want. That was kind of my intention, to kind of keep it open. And
have a chat.
So the idea was to just chat a little bit about like 10 years ago, like what were we thinking at that time? If we look back, like, you know, you had things in your mind when we met and you had these ideas and we were bouncing ideas off of each other, and how we sort of fought to make the book happen. I think a lot of it was you.
Oh man, it was so long ago. I had to like go back to some of my notes because I have a terrible memory, Mike. It had to. I don't remember. I just once some things are done, they leave my brain. Like I think Tina Fey talked about this once in a podcast on SmartList. She was we were asking her about something she did a long time ago, and she's like, I don't know, when I'm done, it goes right in the recycling bin. Like their memories are just gone. But your book does stand out for me because it was so special. Like everything about your book was special. Though it was the first of its kind that I had done like that. It was like fully. Well, did Stefan Bucher's book come out before yours or after?
You did advise me to talk to Stefan, and we talked a little bit. He was a real help in thinking about it. So he did precede us and had sort of done something unique for sure.
Yeah, his was definitely his was I think maybe helped actually make way for yours in the fact that it was heavily illustrated and was a departure from the types of books Peachpit had done before, because Peachpit made its money selling how-to books, how to use Photoshop, Illustrator, Adobe, and all very technical. And then we wanted to, back then we were looking at ways to kind of grow the list and expand and kind of make way into new markets and create books that were evergreen so that we wouldn't have to like continually be in that update cycle of a new software product comes out. And now we have to revise everything, which is expensive. And so we're looking for some books that might have a longer shelf life. So yours had all of that. It was unique. It was, well, there's so many. It was one of the first ones, aside from Stefan's, that was fully illustrated. And I want to give credit to Scott Cowlin for that, because I remember we were talking about what we're going to do with your book, like how are we going to how are we going to do this thing, and I think I was brainstorming with Scott, and he's like, and you had wanted, I think, to do it fully illustrated, but like really focused on the illustrations as opposed to like with the focus being on a lot of text with the illustrations being supporting. And I'm Scott Cullen, our marketing manager then, and he's the publisher now at Rocky Nook. He was like, let's do it. Let's take the risk and like make it a fully illustrated book, which is different from anything we'd done. It was more expensive to create, didn't fit the mold for most of our books. It was definitely it was a departure from what we had done. It was a bit of a risk because it was a new market and a new format and a new author. But boy, look how it turned out.
Yeah, it turned out pretty good. I think it's continuing to sell. And I think I talked to my current editor, Laura, and she said she did like a quick search, and roughly 60,000 copies of the book in all forms have sold in 10 years. Isn't that crazy?
Wow.
60,000 books.
Who knew?
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. We tried lots of experiments with the book, right? You think about, well, number one, you said it's fully illustrated. I produced the typeface of my handwriting so that because I was the story was I was a production designer for 10 years. So I knew what it meant to do like annual reports and sitting on press checks and like all the production stuff. And there was no way I was going to handwrite all that text because I knew there'd be typos. I knew myself too well, right? Even with editors, there's going to be typos and stuff. So I got a typeface made with a collaborator, Delve, and we turned that into a product, which still sells, and we're talking about upgrading.
My husband actually almost used that for a
Really?
logo he was designing just like a week ago. He ended up not using it, but and he was looking at options before he even realized it was yours. He's like, this looks like a go. I'm like, I know that font. It's very familiar.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, that was new. I mean, having this typeface to make my life easier. I remember we sort of, at the time I was using moleskins pretty heavily. So we wanted that rounded corner. So all the books had the rounded corner. That was another layer of different. I think we spent, I think it was 2 weeks trying to find a coating. Like you were doing research on coatings. One you sent me was sort of like linen, and we both kind of felt it like, ew, not that one. And we went with the sort of the matte coating, which oddly enough, Austin Kleon's book, Steal Like an Artist, came out almost at the same time, like maybe a month before the handbook, and they had a similar look and feel. And turns out that his publisher had also used that same kind of matte coating, I guess you would call it, right? It's a coating.
Matte lay flat. Not only was it matte, but it was a lay flat binding. Yeah. So it wasn't, that is another extra expense. When you open it up, it lay flat like a moleskin and not like an extra, an ordinary book.
Right. And I think production wise, your printers were used to doing CMYK stuff. For people who are not printers or designers, CMYK is this cyan, magenta, yellow, black. K is for black. With which, if you look at any book or printed object, those 4 colors are used in different variations to produce any color you like within a range. Like there's some colors like fluorescent it can't produce, or there's limits to what it can produce. But for most part, if you look at a magazine, any magazine, newspapers, even books, they're using the CMYK approach, which is great because you can do full color pictures, you can do all kinds of stuff. And we went away from that. We said we're gonna give that up, and we're gonna do black and 1 PMS Pantone color. And we ended up settling on orange. I think I was the one that picked the orange color.
I love that color. And
it was really tricky because with orange, if you really think about it, like if it's too light, you can't really read the lettering with the color if it's too light. But if it's too dark, then it can look real heavy, and it gets a weird like pumpkin-y look to it. It can get weird, right? So there was like really hard. It took me a long time to like pick the right Pantone orange that would be bright enough and yet not, it would hold up like lettering, right? So I could do lettering in it. But once we kind of nailed that orange, being a production designer really helped me because I knew that I could do tones of it, so like 60%, 30%, 20%, and achieve the feeling of color variation by simply using screens, which we would call them, right?
Yeah.
So that helped me. Same thing with the black, right? We had black, but we also had all the tones of black.
Yeah. And that's how we save money. That was our cost cutting, right? Because we looked, I think we talked about having more colors, but we just couldn't do it because we decided to spend our money on the nice cover and the rounded corners and the leaf lamp binding. Right. But I think it looks even better with 2 colors than it would have with more.
I think so too. It really is iconic, I guess is the right word, right? So, and I think so. The other thing that I was happy about was I knew that we were running on a little bit higher quality paper, so we chose a little bit heavier paper, and it was cream colored, so it wasn't bright white, which gave it sort of a warm, welcoming feeling. That was pretty subtle. I don't think it was like super creamy, but it was off white, I guess is maybe the right way to describe it, I guess. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Because we're trying to imitate the look of what a moleskin paper would look like.
Right. And I think that gave me comfort because I had done the book rework. I'd done illustrations for that book, and I used the same strategy. There I only had black, so all I had were black or tones. And what I found was, depending on when the book was run, like if it was early in the press run, a lot of the tones would get plugged up. Is a pressman's term is, like basically they're running the ink heavy, and so when you use tones, all those little dots that produce the tones get a little tight, just fractionally bigger than they should be, and they bang into each other, and you get this weird, like heavy looking tone, right? So I noticed on some of the early rework books, because they were running on like uncoated paper, and maybe it was the early run, like some of those illustrations got kind of heavy, and over time it settled out. But I knew with this paper that I would have a lot better control, because I think it was a calendared paper, which means it's run through these rollers and hardened, so it's got a smooth surface, right? So the ink will lay on it, and you won't have that kind of variation where the soaking into the uncoated paper can have, like, you have to sort of account for that, right? So we didn't have to worry about that stuff.
Yeah, and where it's printed makes a difference too. I mean, you're talking about print quality. I think a lot of books that are design books that have a lot of these special needs in terms of design requirements, because the books are so expensive to produce, and you can't charge as much as you need to make up for that. A lot of them are printed in Asia, and we never had done that before. At Peachpit, we always printed our books in the United States. So that later on, after your book, I started looking at potentially like figuring out how we could print in Asia to afford some of the books I wanted to create that had they were higher design, more high touch in terms of design, but it adds on shipping delays, and you can't really monitor the quality as well. So there are definitely trade-offs there too.
Right. Yeah.
You're saving money, but you possibly sacrificing some quality control, and shipping was a little bit unreliable, so it'd be sometimes hard to commit to like in-store dates, which a lot of your promotions are built around. So
right, everything's that's the thing I learned about publishing, that I sort of knew. Being an illustrator, I was one cog in the wheel, right? But the authors were the ones that were getting pressured to like deliver the manuscript. Come on, we gotta, because basically, especially the other thing I learned in this whole process was the difference between trade press and tech press. Peachpit is part of tech press. Trade press is like a whole different animal, right? The way it's structured, and like the lead times are super hugely long because of distribution and stuff. So like, you think, I'm a day late with my deadline. Well, that could cascade into like weeks on the back end of that long schedule, right? So I think the other difference too between trade press and tech press was trade press, because it had these long lead times. I've seen this. Authors will work on books like for 2 years, right? And have a deadline where, people don't realize we did all this work, and we did the book, and we did a video, because we were at the time getting into video. We did that all in 9 months, like from start to finish. Just kind of like when I look back at that, I'm like, how did we do that, Nikki? I don't know how we did it. It's completely impossible, but we somehow did it. And we did it twice. We did it again.
Yeah. The video component too. Oh my gosh. We get shipped with a CD at the time. Who does that anymore?
We were the first one. Actually, I remember this. We were one of the first ones who did not ship with the CD. That was a big idea.
Right. It was the card, right?
The codes, where you peel away this thing, and there was codes in there. I occasionally will get a complaint, and that doesn't happen anymore, but early on, someone would buy used on Amazon. Hey, my code doesn't work. Yeah, because you bought a used book, dude. So
Mike, what do you remember? Like, what surprised you the most about? Because you were new to publishing at the time. Like, as a new author, what was like the most surprising thing to you about the process? Like for people, for perhaps other people who have not written a book before and are considering it. Like, I mean, you must have talked about this on podcasts already. So this might be ground.
It's been a few years. Like when the book first came out, I talked a little bit about that more. I think when I look back and think about it, I realized how much of a team effort a book is. Like people make, you'll see an author, their name is on the front, right? And the publisher, I guess, you sort of forget about the publisher part of it, but like having you as a lead editor, right? The acquisition editor. But then there was another editor who was a copy editor who looked for like typos and inconsistent grammar. And man, that's when I learned about the Oxford comma, right? And now that's like, I'm a stickler for that. It's really funny. So, but even beyond that, like production people who were bouncing back with me on production, because our book was unusual in that I did the production,
Yeah.
because I had that skill, like I could do all the InDesign and put it all together, and right. So,
Yeah.
but we talk how that 9 months seemed impossible. It couldn't have been done without you and your team all doing their work. The indexer, someone who
Yeah.
goes through your book and makes an index like crazy. There's probably other proofreaders. And then I think about the video component, having Brian there that we could hire, who was a professional at video, who could sit there and, orchestrate all this stuff. We hired my friend Gabe, who he basically took the raw manuscripts that were, still being kind of edited and turned them into scripts that then I could turn into bullet points and then speak on the camera. Like, if I didn't have that whole network, there's a whole network of people that made it possible for me to produce it. And I think that was a comfort, I think, because I didn't feel like it was all on me. So that was probably the biggest surprise. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, because being a designer and working with teams and knowing that there's press people and there's salespeople and there's the whole bunch of people around projects, it shouldn't have really been a surprise, but I guess it was.
Yeah, well, it's always, everything's more complex than you think it is until you start, then you get into it, and you get into the details of making it, and you realize that, the production person's going to show you all the different kinds of paper, and we're going to talk to you about, every last little detail. And we're going to, I do remember catching on all those commas. Like, I think that's I think that's probably my biggest contribution, was adding that Oxford comma
Probably.
throughout the book. But we had you start off and you had the development editor. I think that was I'm gonna look. I think it was Anne Marie Walker. And I'm gonna check to make sure I'm right. Who takes a look at the overall structure, and you get making sure you have like the structure in place, and that it all makes sense, and you're covering all the right things at the right times. And your book was extra difficult because it was hard to edit. I mean, it was the way it was written the design was so important to it that it was hard to edit and visualize what it was going to look like from an editor's perspective until you actually saw it on the page. And by then you'd already put so much work into it. Like, I can't even remember how many passes we did reviewing, like we reviewed the initial copy, and then we reviewed it after you did a rough layout, I think. And then you did a more final layout, and then maybe a final layout. I think it
was probably like 4 or 5 times. Yeah. The way, for those who don't know, the process worked was, Nikki challenged me to write an outline of each chapter, like what would it cover, and, give it decent detail. And that was so helpful. Like, that was another thing I learned too, was having that structure helped me, because then I could start writing. Like, I would just take a chunk of the manuscript and then just start expanding it and putting my thinking and explaining. And we worked our way through the 7 outlines, basically. And then we had sort of a rough place to start from. And then we started making modifications and editing. And so we got that really tight with probably a couple of rounds of like typo editing and consistency and all that kind of stuff. And then I had the manuscript kind of done. So that was like phase 1, I guess. Then I had to figure out like how I'm going to make this into an illustrated book. So being a designer, my tendency was to do thumbnails to understand. So what I did is I designed my own template. I printed out a bunch of them here, and I would get away from the house. I would go to a coffee shop and buy a coffee and sit there with my little page with all the thumbnails. And I would go page by page through the manuscript and start imagining, okay, that's about as much text, and I need this image to illustrate that, and started to build this all out. And had like I have a whole stack here somewhere of all the thumbnails of all the sketches. And it's funny because when I look at the book, it's like, this is actually pretty accurate. Like, it's not too far off from what I did. So at first I did like a small one, and that helped me calculate because there was a page count that I knew I had to hit, right? So we sort of were, how long is this chapter going to be? And then we added them all up, and the index and the front. And so then we had a sense of like, okay, we fit. Then I did another pass of thumbnails where I did a bigger size thumbnail, which took a whole page, and that's where I did the detail. Then I had a rough idea. Then I started visualizing even bigger the images and where the text would flow. And then that's what I used. I had that next to my desk when I went into production, and that's when I would take either the drawing I made or the submission. So that was another thing we did, is I managed all these submissions of other people, because we thought it was really important that we capture that this is a community of people doing it, and there's lots of ways to do it, and we wanted to represent that, because I really did not want it to be the Mike Rohde Sketchnote book with just all my work. Like I did it to the point that to explain ideas, but never as a showcase, really, because I wanted it to look more like, hey, you can do it that way or this way or the other way. And there were, 7 different.
How did you decide? I can't remember. How did you decide who was going to contribute in that way? Did you reach out to friends you knew?
I think, a lot of them were friends. A lot of people I didn't really know super well. I just started talking to them and said, hey, I'm working on this book. I have these 3 people that are going to do spreads. Would you be open? There were some that were clear, like Eva Delata Lamb was a friend of mine, really prolific sketchnoter, beautiful work. Your teacher, right?
So
and
good.
you took a spread and did one, and a variety of other people. Creighton Berman was someone I knew as well, and just a variety of people. But there were a few people, so there were some that were like designers that I knew could handle it, but there were a couple that were on the edge, like Jessica Esch, who is someone in the book. She's a librarian, I believe, right? But she's like passionate about this approach, and her style was really simple and clear and structured, and so her style looked really different. So there was some, like, I had sort of like I think we had 7 slots or 8 slots, I can't remember. So there was like probably 2/3 were sort of like, I know who those people are, but there's like 2 or 3 people like, I'm not sure, like, who should that be? And I started looking around because I was looking at all this work. Like, I started to talk to people, and I could sort of tell by their personality and the work they did, and like that would be the right person. So it was a little bit of taste making, I guess, where I would pick. We were trying as our best we could to not make it like all amazing graphic designers, so that you look at the samples and then you feel like, well, I can't do that. Like we had to make sure to mix in regular people too, right? So you had like a gamut of structure and style.
Yeah, they're all good. I was just looking through the book again last night to remind me, it's been a while actually since I picked it up, and I was just like, oh, I just remembered how much I love it. I love this book. I love the contributors. It just makes you want to be more creative.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when you were making this, I was trying to do the sketchnoting too, and I've never been able to draw. It's always been something I want to do. I wish I was good at. It's always the first thing I want. If I had a hobby, it would be that. But I don't have time for hobbies, and also I'm a little intimidated by it. So yeah, I would try sketchnoting in my meetings at work, and I remember it's so how many times people would look at what I was doing, and they'd look over my shoulder, and they'd ask me what I was drawing, and then I'd tell them about your book, and then they would get excited about it, and they would start doing it. So it was fun. It just the whole process makes you feel creative, even if you're not a professional designer. Mm-hmm. It makes it feel like you can do it, and it feels fun. It makes you feel like a little kid again. Like you said, like kids draw all the time. You have that ability within yourself. You just have forgotten how to do it, mm-hmm. and it does tap that part of you where you're like, it makes things feel fun again. It made some really boring meetings fun for me.
That's good. That's a win.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question for you, because you're more of the publishing expert. I've learned a lot. So I don't know if you remember, like when we first did the book, like I kept asking you questions, like you would tell me something like, hey, we earned out the advance. I'm like, is that good? And you're like, yes, that's good. Like most books don't earn the advance or whatever. You gave me the stats, like, and it constantly would happen, because I was, again, the work I'd done was 2 or 3 illustrations for pretty big books. Rework was a huge book.
Yeah.
This led to more illustration work, but I was just one part in it. I didn't see the whole, I didn't have that bird's eye view of like everything. So I didn't know what to expect, which is probably good, right? Like, I think not having expectations maybe was better. I don't know. I couldn't be disappointed. I don't
know. I've always felt, here's a full confession. Like, I've always felt a little guilty that I published your book, in that I didn't, because I loved it, right? I thought I knew it was going to be an amazing book. I love the topic. I loved everything about it. But you probably could have made a lot more money publishing with a non-tech publisher. I mean, that's because your book is not a tech book. It's really more of like an Austin Kleon type book, right? It's more of like a Jessica Hagee, How to Be Interesting kind of book. It does teach you things, but it's so visual and different and creative that it didn't really fit the category of the types of books we were making and the types of books our salespeople knew how to sell that well. It was something we were experimenting with, but like I always felt a little bit like, oh, I probably should have told Mike to go publish somewhere else where he could have gotten a lot more money than what we. I mean, and it's not that like, you know, like the advance and royalties and all that I gave you were not less than. I mean, they were good for what we paid people, but in a different industry altogether. I mean, so I'm going to apologize to you now, 10 years later, Mike. I should have sent you away.
Well,
I should have sent you away.
I feel pretty good. I think we've done pretty well. And, you know, David and I, my agent, had that discussion, like, because he said, hey, you know, if you want, we could like spend 6 months and like do a full proposal and like go after Random House or these guys. But I remember, you know, we have to think about that time frame, which 2011, 2012. Like, I mean, the only books about visual thinking that had been out were really Dan Rome was sort of like the leader in that space, right? And, you know, Austin Kleon's just came out before, like I said, it was like a month before, and he was with an alternate publisher, right? So I kind of wonder, I thought the same thing, but I thought, you know what? I don't know if the trade press would have been ready for it. And my concern, and Dave talked to me about this, was they might have forced you into like a, you know, a formula that made sense for them, but not for the content, right? So like that, I think, was a worthy trade-off in my view, because I wanted complete control, which I got. That was worth it, I think.
Yeah, that is the one thing I could give you, was complete creative control. So good. Thank you. You make me feel less guilty and bad. Like, if I felt that way about several other people too, like books. I'm like, oh, I just want to work with you so badly. People are so interesting and they do such great work. And like, and I always, for some of them, I just felt like I always felt just a little bit guilty, because I knew in my heart you might be able to make more money elsewhere, but I wanted to work with you, and I wanted to work with, you know, Stefan and, you know, Robin Landon, Rose Ganella, and all those amazingly talented people. So apologies to all of them for the money I didn't make them.
Well, I think, you know, I'm trying to think, I think it's Seth Godin that talks a lot about that the important thing is attention, right? That the attention is hard to get. Maybe it was somebody else. So like, I think it was definitely a guerrilla operation, right? There wasn't a lot of budget for promotion, but I think I had been doing guerrilla stuff for a long time, like with my Palm Tip Sheet, which is this newsletter I just cooked up one day and ended up with 5,000 subscribers and sold it to another company. Like, all that was guerrilla marketing stuff. Like, I experimented with all kinds of stuff. So it was just the same kind of challenge. Like, well, I listen to podcasts. What if I can get on podcasts and talk about the book? And we aggressively seeded the people that we felt would be open to it with sample copies. So I think that really helped. And we gave away lots of books, but I think it was a good investment. So
you were so good. You're one of the best at that too, that I am of all the authors I had. You were the one who was willing to do, I think, the most work marketing the books, like, and putting in like, I remember you created an entire press kit. I mean, this is something authors would come to us expecting us to do. And we really didn't have a big budget for marketing. I mean, it was, the margins of publishing are so tight, and especially in tech publishing. Like some authors would come expecting like book tours and bookstores, which we stopped doing like a zillion years ago. And, you know, or like full on marketing campaigns. But you know, Peachpit at the time really put all their marketing efforts really into specific like bookstore promotions and getting your books in front of store buyers, but not a lot of anything else. And so when I was trying to find authors, I was always looking for people, and this is true now today of anybody, I think, in publishing. You're looking for people who already have a platform. You're looking for people who are, and this is what I tell people even now when they ask me, like, I want to write a book, you know, what is your advice? I'm like, well, are you the expert on the topic? That are you the person everybody knows as the, like, you're the Mike, you're the sketchnoting guy. If I'm going to want to learn about sketchnoting, first person comes to mind, Mike Rohde. Are you the first person who comes to someone's mind on that topic? Do you have a large network? What is your social media following? Do you have other ways to promote your book? If it's not social media, do you have a big newsletter list? Like, how are you, what makes you the perfect person to write this book? And you had all of those things, right? You you coined the term sketchnoting. You were the one really who was like making all the noise about it, like out there and constantly talking about it and promoting and teaching about it. And I remember you were so thorough. Like, we gave the books away. You created the press kit. You made it easy for people to promote the book. Because remember, you made that that press kit. You put it on Flickr, so we posted pictures of the inside of your book for people to use. You had your headshot. You wrote your own tweets for people to be able to like retweet. That's what people do now today. It's standard, but at the time nobody did that. I mean, you were so good at it, and I think that's one of the reasons too that we were willing to take such a risk on you and the book and invest so much money into creating something for a first-time author, is because you really came to us with all of those marketing skills, and we knew you would do more than your share to help us sell it. And I think that's part of what made it so successful too. I mean, it's an amazing book in and of itself, but you can make an amazing book and it still won't sell it if people don't know about it.
Right. I think, the other angle that I throw in here too is luck. Like, there has to be a little bit of component in luck. I don't know what percentage. Like the timing of like when it came out and who was open to it, and there weren't, like we talked early on when we talked about contract stuff. Like, well, it's got to be the market has to be there, but it can't be too big because then you're just another player. But it's got to be big enough to like that was this weird, and we sort of came in at just this right moment, I think, when people wanted it. The other thing that's really fascinating about the life of the book is probably the first 2-3 years were probably 90% were graphic designers that were buying it, because that's who we knew, right? Not only Peachpit knew that demographic and that kind of mindset, but I was one, and I knew what other designers would like, and a lot of those people on the seed list were other designers who I think would appreciate it, right? So that was like the core. But like about 5 years in, suddenly teachers discovered it, and they went crazy for it, right? Because they could see like, okay, I can have my kids like drawing that I keep telling them they shouldn't do. This is actually something they can do, and it will help them remember and do better on their tests and be more engaged. Like, yeah, sign me up, right? So then suddenly teachers got onto it, and they're like a different kind of an animal, because anything that will help them teach their kids, they're willing to do it within reason, right? Obviously, but they saw immediate, and the feedback I got was immediate response and positive. And then they started, like, there were teachers that were going off to like conferences for teachers and teaching sketchnoting, which, my mindset again also is more of a growth mindset, and you should teach it. Like, I'm more interested in everybody doing it, because I think as you grow the people that want to do it, that just naturally means I rise, the rising tide concept, so, but that was a real fascinating shift, was to teachers just suddenly taking ownership. And like, now I think probably it's a lot more teachers that actually are into it, and it's starting to get into schools. The last tidbit about this that I'll say is my daughter came home. She's a middle school kid. She came home from school and said, "Hey, Dad, the teacher just introduced sketchnoting in class today." So I went up to her after and said, "My dad wrote the book," right? Because they had books. So she was really proud of that.
Oh, see, okay. You made your kids proud of you. Mission accomplished. You don't even, you can drop your mic and walk away. I think that's well done.
Yeah.
Well done. I thought it was interesting, like when we did the workbook, it was interesting to see not just teachers, but all these different professions. And you've had, I'm sure people reach out to you over the years from all different fields, talking about the ways that sketchnoting has helped them do their jobs, like doctors explaining, complicated doctor terms to patients. Yeah. I love those stories. I love seeing how people use it in their daily work, and how it makes a difference, in all these different scenarios, whether it's traveling or in schools or any of those places. Is there any one that sticks out to you as being more or less more memorable than the others? I mean, there's so many, I'm sure, but is there one that mean more to you than others?
Well, there's two, and they're sort of similar to each other. So there was a teacher, local teacher, Cheryl Knezel, who was on the podcast a couple seasons ago. She was an art teacher. She stumbled into sketchnoting. She says it changed her life because she got into graphic recording and all this stuff. But while she was a teacher, there was a student, I think his name was Dylan or Brady. I don't know what his name was, but he had something called dysgraphia, which is this condition where when you look at text, it just looks like a gray jumble and you can't make sense of it. Makes it really hard to read and process, makes it hard to write notes in a typical format. So he apparently, through Cheryl, discovered sketchnoting and started to do it. And basically, before he discovered sketchnoting, it was pretty much guaranteed he wasn't going to college, because like it's only going to get worse, right? You can't process this information. Turns out that sketchnoting was like his salvation in a way, to make him be able to understand and process information in his way. Of course, he had accommodations to allow him to do this, and so he's at college, maybe even graduated by now, but he wouldn't have been. Then there was another woman who reached out to me, and it was her son who had a similar dysgraphia, and then a few other things mixed in there that made it complicated for him. And so the same thing happened again. It's like, holy cow, how is this happening? Like I could have never predicted this, but this little kid was taking his pencil and he translated notes in the way that made sense to him. And was drawing images he could remember. He could do like little speeches off of what he wrote. Like it really worked for him. And she also expressed, like, I never thought he was going to go to college, and now he's going to go to college. So that crazy? Like how could we have known that 10 years ago that would even happen? But it did.
I love stories like that. It makes it feel, it just makes your work feel meaningful. Like you have the work we did, mostly you, but the work that you did just really, it truly impacts people's lives. Like you are helping people in a meaningful way. And what you did really matters. It really deeply matters to some people. I love that.
Yeah. I can't think of a better way to wrap up our discussion than focusing on, that's where it's at. The book continues to sell. It's in multiple languages now. The most recent was Vietnamese. That suddenly, like, that was a really interesting story. I got this email from this guy, like, hey, I want to do your book in Vietnamese. Yeah, not a problem. Let me connect you with the rights people at Peachpit. So I did. I forgot about it. And then, I don't know, 4 months later, I get this package in the mail, and it's like both of my books translated into Vietnamese. They had
so cool.
They had a bookmark in there that came with it. Like, holy cow! Like, how did that happen? So there are a few translations, German and French and Czech and Ukrainian. It's in Ukrainian as well as Russian, Vietnamese, Chinese as well. So that was really satisfying to see it translating into other languages, and maybe not as many as some, because if you just have text to flow in and somebody translates, it's a different level of challenge. But certainly the ones who did do the translations really did nice work. And the German and the French version, I was pretty active in cultivating who could be local French or German speakers to replace the American ones in those versions, and being there to help with advising and all that kind of stuff. So,
your book is not an easy one to do it. I'm amazed that there's so many translated versions of it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know how they did that.
You really need a designer, and you probably need, ideally, a designer who's an illustrator, or two separate people. The thing that I'll say about, I think it's both the Ukrainian and the Russian versions, is if you somehow manage to get a copy of them, they were crazy. They had a whole team, and they went through all the Sketchnote samples and replaced all the English text with Cyrillic text. So when you look at the book, it looks like it's completely done in Russian or Ukrainian. It's insane.
Oh, cool. I would love to see that. You'll have to show it to me next time you're in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
Bring all of your copies with you.
Yeah, I'll show them to you. So, well, it's so good to have you on this part of the podcast, talking a little bit about the history. I mean, it's probably, we're probably the most interested in the discussion, but there might be people, who are kind of curious, like, how did this thing happen and what was it like? And I think you're right. There's people that are, I was one of those people that thought, I'm never going to write a book. Like, I'd love to, but what am I going to write a book about? I don't know what to write a book about. And
well, this is one thing, because I was going back and thinking about this, and you said in your book and in your notes and everything you wrote about it at the time, that you started doing sketchnoting because you were bored and you decided you hated taking notes, and you gave yourself a small challenge, a small challenge, an experiment, a small experiment to just try to make it more fun for you, and look at how it has changed your life. So I would say, to me, I was thinking about that again. It's so inspiring. Like, one small change, just try one thing, try one small thing, change it up, experiment. It doesn't have to be big. And who knows where it will go, right? Who knows where it will lead you? I love that. I feel like that just gives you hope, right? That you don't know what tomorrow or 10 years is going to be. You could change one thing small, and it could not only change your life, but look at how many others, you know?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So
it is amazing.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show and chit-chatting, and we'll have to get together again at the 15th anniversary and see if we can still remember anything.
Oh boy, I'll be like, if I remember my own name.
Yeah,
the 15th anniversary.
We'll be sitting in the old person's homes in our wheelchairs, zooming each other. I don't know.
It's good to catch up, Mike.
Yep. Well, thanks a lot. The Sketchnote Army podcast was created by me, Mike Rohde, and brought to you by Rohde Design Studios. It's produced and edited by Alec Polianis of AMP Creative Studios. The theme music was created by John Schiedermeyer. To support the creation of this show, I invite you to buy one of my books, the Sketchnote Handbook or the Sketchnote Workbook. You can find the books on Amazon, or go to peachpit.com and use the code ROHDE40 for 40% off. Please share this podcast with other visual thinking friends, and be sure to leave a nice rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening app so others can find the show.